I'm Steve Brier. I'm from City University of New York. I'm, like Greg, absolutely delighted to offer closing comments at this wonderful event organized by Brian and Joan and many of the students who are here as a kind of self-fest trip for Brian. I can't think of a more worthy recipient of such an honor. I've known Brian Palmer for almost 4 decades now. I met Brian and Greg Keeley in 1977 when we were young radicals and Marxists at a Marho conference entitled History and Culture, Legitimation and Resistance in Class Societies, held in New York City in November of that year. Marho, for those in the audience too young to remember, was founded in 1973, and I should say it's an acronym that stands for Middle Atlantic Radical Historians Organization, which it was never known as. And then there was a big debate within the organization in the early 70s, were we really the Marxist Historians Organization? But I took that position, but I lost, so it just remained Marho. So it was founded in '73, and among its many activities, including that annual conference, it published the Radical History Review, which I described in my Ilwich report on the 1977 conference as, quote, the voice of the younger generation of radical historians in the United States, unquote. Although RHR is still publishing, the original gangsters like me who were involved back in the day are not obviously so young anymore. The three of us, meaning Brian, Greg, and myself, along with the Los Angeles comrade John Amsden, were on a panel evaluating David Montgomery's work. If memory serves, Brian offered a paper, among probably the first ones that he did, appreciating David's contribution to labor history, while Amsden and I criticized Montgomery for not being sufficiently Marxist in terms of his workers' control argument that was then all the rage in North American labor history circles. I like to think that this is one of the few occasions in the last 4 decades in which my position in Amsden's was to the left of Comrade Palmer's, and Keeley's as well, but I think that went without saying, yeah. That New York City meeting began a very long and sustained friendship and several intellectual collaborations with Brian on projects that I consider an important part of whatever modest contributions that I have made over the past 4 decades to the history profession in general and to the field of North American radical labor Marxist history that we have celebrated here in the past few days. Before I turn to my recollections of Brian's role on these collaborative projects, I want to say something about his obsessive-compulsive book and memorabilia buying. I was convinced for many years that while Brian liked me and respected me as a historian, at least I hope so, the key reason he embraced me as a friend was that my East Village apartment in Manhattan, in which I've lived since the year before the 1977 Marho Conference, is located a few short blocks from the used book mecca of Manhattan, the Strand bookstore on Broadway and 12th Street, which was, if you've ever been there, you'll know what I'm talking about, but if you go there now, you won't. It's now a very different place than it was back in the day. It's kind of like a glorified Barnes & Noble now. But Brian haunted the Strand with great regularity on his frequent trips to New York, along with many of the now vanished smaller used bookstores that clustered near the Strand. Brian never met a history book, a used history or Marxist book, or a piece of working class ephemera that he didn't want to own. For those who didn't know Brian before he started living with Joan Sangster in Peterborough, his house in Newburgh was filled floor to ceiling with books, not just in the copious bookshelves that lined the many walls, but also stacked in tall piles like skyscrapers in every room, including the kitchen of that sizable old farmhouse. The first time I stayed there, I came down for breakfast. Brian sat me down in a little chair in his kitchen table, and I looked on either side of me and thought, if there's an earthquake, I will die. These things went 10 feet in the air. So, I believe that when Brian moved in with Joan, he kept that house for a while as a place where his books could have a happy abode. I don't know, I think he ultimately sold that house. Keeley was telling me this last night. I've recently been reading The House of 20,000 Books, a wonderful new reminiscence of Kaiman Abramsky, noted British collector of Marxist and Yiddish books, letters, newspapers, and other memorabilia written by his grandson, Sasha. Abramsky's collection was said to be the finest private library on Marxism in Britain, and his grandson's description of how it took over his grandfather's North London Victorian home reminded me so much of Brian's old Newburgh house that it was downright eerie. Am I imagining that Brian once told me he thought his collection may number also 20,000 books, but then I'd hear from Keely and from Beth that his collection might be 30 or 40,000 books. So, you know, the big question, I guess what I would say is, I was going to write a sentence that said, I now think of Brian Palmer as the Kaiman Abramsky of Canada, but now I think the much more appropriate thing to say is Kaiman Abramsky is the Brian Palmer of England. The big question facing Brian as he drifts off into retirement, and hopefully not into senescence, is can he bring himself to sell pieces of his precious collection? Kaiman Abramsky wasn't able to do that, or even to fully catalog his remarkable collection, leaving his heirs with that those very difficult tasks. I hope Joan, Beth, or heaven forfend any grandchildren who come along are spared this prospect. Brian says selling his collection is his retirement project. I will believe that when I see one of his adverts somewhere, and I'm not optimistic. Turning to more serious matters, or at least appropriately scholarly ones, the three collaborative projects I want to say something about: Brian's contribution to the writing of Who Built America, his 1990 Descent into Discourse, which Russell mentioned yesterday, subtitle which is The Reification of Language and the Writing of Social History, and his work as the longtime editor of Labor Le Travail are three tiny bullet points on Brian's extraordinarily large and impressive CV. As this conference has attested, Brian has conceived and written a number of other very important books. His Amazon authors page lists a dozen or more. Interestingly, you can't find Brian's CV, or at least I couldn't, on the internet, and I'm a pretty good user of the internet. No doubt part of his stubborn resistance to digital technology. But he's written on a range of subjects as you've heard about today, books on Canadian labor history, past and most recent, E.P. Thompson, James P. Cannon, with a volume out with a second one coming, delayed by his side trip to write yet a different and separate and important book on the 1934 Minneapolis Teamsters strike. And one of my favorites, Cultures of Darkness, which was just mentioned by Christopher, a tour de force published in 2000 that is the closest I think Brian has come in his considerable oeuvre to an intellectual homage to the critical work of his friend and mentor, Edward Thompson, and in which, I want to note, I was appropriately acknowledged by Brian in the acknowledgments as his New York concierge. because he stayed so frequently at our East Village apartment while doing village research for the book, or to bring Beth, his beloved daughter, for their periodic visits to the big city, which he, of course, took her to the Strand, but also to a range of other things as well. The political project of the Darkness book is best summarized in the introduction when Brian, with his typical acerbity, calls out the then reigning obsession in academia with post-thises and that's, a subject that he had first addressed a decade earlier, as I will soon note, in Descent into Discourse. This is the quote from the introduction. The endless calls of the interdisciplinary post-writing for attention to marginality and identity will never be adequately responded to by theoretical abstractions, by statements, however principled, of the need to do more than chronicle diversity. Perhaps what we need then is an attempt, however partial, to touch down on some chapters in the history of marginality and transgression. And with that final understated point, Brian is often running in the Cultures of Darkness, traversing historical epochs from the medieval to the modern and whole continents, including a deep immersion in North American and European working class cultures and oppositions. Almost 600 pages later, The endnotes alone take up 130 of those pages, printed in a very small typeface. We stagger to the end, exhausted but exhilarated, and well-educated by this Thompsonian romp through the cultural, social, and transgressive histories of early and late capitalism. Very few, if any, of Brian's peers write with his fluidity, grace, command of the sources, and absolute lightning speed, all of which help explain his vast output of important books, scholarly articles, and political interventions over the past 4 decades. My direct intellectual engagement with Brian as a historian and writer after our initial 1977 meeting began a decade later when I was faced with what seemed like the impossible task of finishing the writing and editing of the American Social History Project's own magnum opus, Who Built America? Working People in the Nation's Economy, Politics, Culture, and Society. I had co-founded ASHP in 1981 with Herbert Gutman, as I mentioned yesterday, and had headed the project as its director until 1998. Who Built America was the centerpiece of the project's work, which suffered a major setback in 1985 when Herb Gutman died suddenly of a heart attack at what seemed to us young whippersnappers as the advanced age of 57. And we simultaneously lost our funding from the NEH and the Ford Foundation. I was faced with the unenviable dual tasks of keeping the project afloat and finishing both volumes of Who Built America. The second volume would not have seen the light of day in 1992 without Brian's support and hard work, and that of many other historians, including Nelson Lichtenstein, Roy Rosenzweig, Joshua Freeman, Joshua Brown, Susan Porter Benson, and Eric Foner. Brian took on the critical task of reconceiving and rewriting the first 4 chapters of the second volume, covering the Gilded Age and progressivism. His singular contribution to those chapters, besides their concision and his abiding commitment to the collaborative writing and editing process, was Brian's decision to feature the individual stories of little-known late 19th century working-class leaders to give fuller meaning and importance to the history of these critical decades in the history of U.S. capitalism. For all of Brian's hard-edged Marxist theoretical rigor, he is still enough of an old-fashioned social historian to want to tell us how ordinary working people, not just their famous leaders, responded to capitalist depredations across time. Brian's contribution didn't make the first edition of Who Built America quite textbookish enough, a task left for subsequent editions, but it did make it the most interesting and provocative, and my personal favorite, of the 3 editions that we have published of Who Built America to date. My second collaboration with Brian was less a collaboration than a midwifery on my part. I co-edited with my late comrades and fellow social historians Roy Rosenzweig and Susan Porter Benson a book series at Temple University Press entitled Critical Perspectives on the Past, which was born out of our collective work on the Radical History Review and Marho. 10 years before the Darkness book, and around the same time as he was finishing his work on Who Built America, Brian became alarmed by what he saw as the accelerating linguistic turn in history championed by Joan Scott and other labor and social historians, Moncke, and that's how I think of them, that was transforming not only academic history, but many other disciplines as well, as Russell told us yesterday. Worried about postmodernism's potentially deleterious impact on the history field and its attractions to young scholars and graduate students, Brian proposed Descent into Discourse, a polemical intervention in the debate in which he posited historical materialism as the necessary antidote. With an epigram from Marx and Engels' The German Ideology that reads, quote, many of you may recognize this quote, "The problem of descending from the world of thoughts to the actual world is turned into the problem of descending from language to life." Brian echoed Marx and Engels' analysis early in the preface to the book when he asserted that, quote, "Critical theory is no substitute for historical materialism. Language is not life," unquote. For those who know Brian's polemical tendencies, Descent into Discourse would do Marx and Trotsky proud. To say the tone of the prose is sharp-edged is a gross understatement, and I suspect Joan Scott is still singed by Brian's critical attack on her postmodernist deviationism. Roy Sue and I drew straws for which one of the series editors would edit Brian's manuscript when it came to Temple University Press. Sue, always an arch-feminist, and I mean arch in both senses of that term, disqualified herself immediately because in her own inimitable words, she said she didn't think she could deal with Brian's polemical tone, which she described as suffering from testosterone poisoning. Not surprisingly, I've waited a long time to be able to read that. Not surprisingly, the editing task fell to me as Brian's friend and editor on Who Built America. And while the polemical tone in Descent into Discourse is indeed sharp, it is thoroughly appropriate to the subject matter and the main characters, especially in retrospect, as we see the ways in which postmodernism was an unfortunate detour, and I'm being generous here, that moved us away from more important and apt theoretical analyses, especially historical materialism. Brian was absolutely right about that, and I consider Descent into Discourse one of the most important and consequential books of the 36 we published over a quarter century that I co-edited the critical perspectives on the past series. Finally, I want to take note of Brian's long and dedicated service, as we've heard, over these last 2 days, as editor of Labor Literature, which he took over 18 years ago from Brother Keeley, the journal's founding editor. The editing of LLT speaks to an underappreciated aspect of Brian's career, but now I hear from all the students who were here that it is hardly underappreciated. His willingness to devote considerable time and energy to supporting younger, and not only younger, scholars by editing and publishing their intellectual work and encouraging it. LLT has also seemed to me to have been more radical and consequential in what it publishes than its U.S. doppelganger journal Labor, especially over the course of the last half-dozen years. As LLT editor, Brian was much more willing to engage in intellectually risky and political controversial contributions to the journal. That willingness is best expressed in one of my favorite sections of LLT, Controversy Polemique, which I hope I'm not butchering that, the French word, which reflects the journal's and Brian's embrace of conflictual modes of intellectual engagement. Brian has always believed, as do I, that history is contested terrain, not only a celebration of what working people did in the past, but also an active engagement with and consideration of alternative political and organizational possibilities, and not always progressive outcomes. That is something we both learned at the hands of mentors like Edward Thompson and Herb Gutman. I consider it one of the milestones of my career that I was able to publish my modest contribution to the Controversy Polemique section in number 23, the final spring 2014 issue of LLT that Brian published before hanging up his editorial spurs. My article on New York City teacher unionism and its opposition to community control of schools had the added benefit of being improved by Brian's incredibly sharp and astute edits and emendations. I have to say it was nice to finally have the editing shoe in our relationship on the other foot. I'm hoping these comments are not sounding too much like those delivered at a wake. I don't suppose that Brian Palmer, despite his impending retirement, I had written originally formal retirement, but now I understand it's delayed, so I had to change it to an impending retirement, but who knows how impending it really is, from the university, is done researching and writing history and publishing fiery polemics on a wide range of topics. My hope for Brian, as it is for myself when I reach this same point at some point in the future, is that retirement allows him to be even more productive, if that's possible, intellectually and politically. And worst comes to worst, Brian, you can always retreat into the petty bourgeois lifestyle of a bookshop owner and online purveyor of working class books and ephemera. Thank you.